1 second later, life turned into memory. The old clock in the hospital hallway ticked with cruel indifference, its hands moving forward even as life inside the room behind closed doors threatened to stand still. For Michael, a man in his late 30s with hollowed eyes and trembling hands, every second was torture. His wife, Anna, lay on the bed, monitors humming, her breath shallow. The doctors whispered in language that turned hope into fragments. Then, 1 second later, the heart monitor spiked, and Michael's life split into a before and after. Anna's eyes fluttered open briefly, as if reaching through the fog. She tried to speak but managed only a faint smile, one he would remember longer than his own reflection. Her hand slipped into his, fragile as paper, and though her lips never formed the words, he heard them echo inside his soul. "Don't forget me." Then the monitor flatlined, and silence swallowed the room. Outside, life carried on. Nurses rushed, phones rang. The city beyond the window pulsed with ordinary rhythm. But for Michael, the world had fractured. Anna was no longer part of it, except as a ghost in memory. 1 second later, his future was nothing but fragments of a past he could never reclaim. The funeral came with rain, as if the sky itself wept for him. Friends offered hollow words. Family placed hands on his shoulders. But none of it could pierce the cavern inside. He stood before the grave, staring at the stone with her name etched into permanence. And he wondered how ink could so easily cage a life once so bright. The umbrellas around him blurred into faceless shapes. Only her absence had definition. At home, the rooms were unbearable. Every corner carried her presence. A mug half-chipped, a scarf on the chair, the faint scent of lavender on her pillow. Michael sat in their bedroom and felt as if the walls pressed inward, crushing him with memory. He wanted to scream, but his throat betrayed him. Instead, he whispered into the silence, "You promised forever." And the silence replied with nothing at all. Days became weeks, and grief became ritual. He wandered the streets aimlessly, searching for places they once loved. The little cafe by the river, the bookstore where she lingered in poetry aisles, the bench where she laughed at pigeons. Each location was both a sanctuary and a wound. Strangers passed him by, unaware that he lived in a museum where every exhibit was love turned into loss. One night, unable to sleep, Michael opened Anna's old sketchbook. She had filled it with drawings of moments too small for photographs. Their hands clasped, the curve of his smile when he thought she wasn't looking, the window of their first apartment glowing against the dusk. The pages blurred as tears fell, staining the paper. But he turned each one like scripture. She had already known memory was all they would have left. In his dreams, she came alive. Anna walked toward him across fields of light, her hair loose, her eyes endless, her voice echoing with warmth. "I'm still here," she told him. He would reach for her. But always, just as their fingers touched, he woke. The sheets beside him cold, her side of the bed empty. Dreams became both salvation and cruelty, gifts wrapped in thorns. Michael's friends urged him to move on, to live his life. But he found the phrase absurd. How does one move on when every breath carries the weight of someone else's absence? Life had not ended for him, but it had turned into something hollow, a stage where he acted out existence while his soul lingered elsewhere. His laughter was forced, his words rehearsed, his days mechanical. 1 second later, every joy he encountered twisted into guilt. When he tasted food he enjoyed, he thought of how Anna would have savored it. When he heard music, he remembered how she danced barefoot in their living room. Even in small pleasures, he felt betrayal, as though being alive was a crime he committed daily. Memory had become his master, ruling over every heartbeat. Months blurred, and Michael began to write letters to Anna. At first they were small notes. "I miss you. I can't do this. Why did you leave?" But soon they grew into long confessions, pages upon pages of sorrow, hope, anger, and longing. He tucked them into a box beneath their bed, a coffin of paper where he buried pieces of his soul. It was the only dialogue he had left. On the anniversary of her death, Michael returned to the hospital. He stood in the hallway where the clock ticked still, the same indifferent rhythm. And for a moment he swore he heard her whisper again, "Don't forget me." He pressed his forehead against the sterile wall, tears streaking, and whispered back, "I never could. I never will." Life outside still rushed, but inside him time had frozen. He started visiting places they had never been together, desperate to create distance from the weight of shared memories. Yet everywhere he went, Anna appeared, in the smile of a stranger, in the rhythm of a song, in the shape of clouds at dusk. The world conspired to remind him that memory was not a box to close but a tide that rose without warning. Sometimes he thought about letting go, about following her into silence. The thought terrified him, but it also comforted him. He would sit at their window, staring at the horizon, and wonder if the line between sky and earth was where memory became eternity. But always, something tethered him. Her words, her drawings, her voice saying, "Don't forget me." And so Michael lived not in the present, not in the past, but in the fragile place between them. Every step forward was anchored by memory, every smile shadowed by grief. 1 second later, life had turned into memory, and memory had become his life. Michael began to walk at night, roaming streets empty of people but heavy with echoes. Streetlights flickered like faint stars, guiding him through neighborhoods that looked alive but felt hollow. Each step became a meditation on memory. The crunch of leaves underfoot reminded him of autumn afternoons with Anna. The smell of rain carried him back to nights when they ran laughing under one umbrella. The city itself became a ghost, and he walked inside it as though inside a dream. At times, he found himself talking aloud to her, ignoring the curious glances of those who overheard. In the grocery store, he would whisper, "Should I get the peaches you loved?" In the park, he murmured, "Do you remember the dog that chased us here?" To others, he was a lonely man muttering to himself. But to Michael, he was still a husband speaking to his wife. Memory was his dialogue, and silence was her reply. As months became seasons, he noticed how time betrayed him. People around him began to forget Anna. Her name slipped from conversations, her face vanished from gatherings, her laughter no longer echoed in rooms full of friends. Michael grew resentful. How could they forget someone who had carved her light into his every breath? To him, Anna was eternal. But to the world, she was already fading. The cruelty of it gnawed at him. One evening, he sat at their dining table, staring at her empty chair. He placed her favorite teacup across from him and poured hot water into it as if she might appear. Steam curled upward, catching the light like a fragile spirit. Michael leaned forward, whispering, "You're still here." But the only sound was the settling of the house. The chair stayed empty. The tea cooled untouched. His nights grew restless. Dreams of Anna became vivid, almost real. In one dream, she sat beside him on a beach, the horizon burning orange, her hair catching the wind. "You're holding on too tightly," she said, her voice tender but firm. "You can't live in memory alone." He woke with his heart pounding, unsure if the dream was comfort or warning. But when dawn came, he returned to his rituals, unwilling to release the only thread he had left. Michael began keeping journals, each page filled with recollections of Anna. He wrote down their first meeting, their first kiss, their silly arguments, the sound of her laugh, the way she brushed her hair behind her ear when nervous. The journals stacked higher, forming towers of paper that surrounded him like walls. Friends worried he was burying himself. But to Michael, he was preserving eternity. Every word written was a rebellion against forgetting. Sometimes, he carried one of her scarves in his pocket, pressing it to his face when no one looked. The faint scent of lavender and soap clung to the fabric, transporting him instantly. Memory was no longer just mental, it had texture, smell, weight. Anna lived in fragments of objects as much as in his thoughts. To part with them felt like betraying her existence. One afternoon, He passed a playground where children laughed without restraint. The sound pierced him like a blade. He and Anna had dreamed of children, spoken of names, planned rooms that would never be filled. He sat on a bench covering his face. And for the first time, he let grief rage. He sobbed until his chest burned. Until strangers glanced uneasily. Until exhaustion silenced him. That night, he wrote Anna a letter that began simply, "Our children live only in memory now." Seasons shifted again. And Michael noticed something strange. Though grief never left him, he began to sense Anna in unexpected ways. When sunlight struck the glass in their apartment just right, it painted the room in golden tones she once adored. When wind rustled through trees, it carried the cadence of her laughter. When he stumbled on poetry she once underlined, it felt as if she had left him messages scattered through time. Memory wasn't just pain, it was also a haunting kind of presence. He wondered if Anna had become part of the world itself, stitched into light, wind, and sound. Perhaps life after loss was not about clinging to memory but about learning to see the beloved everywhere. The thought both frightened and soothed him. He feared he was deluding himself, but he also feared letting go of the illusion. In the quiet, he whispered again, "Don't forget me." And this time, the breeze through the window almost seemed to whisper back. Yet the weight of isolation remained. Friends drifted further away, unable to carry the gravity of his grief. Family visited less, their words stumbling, their eyes avoiding the shrine his apartment had become. Michael felt himself becoming invisible, a man trapped between the living and the dead. Memory kept him alive, but it also kept him from truly living. The paradox crushed him daily. One night, standing at the riverbank where he and Anna had once shared wine under stars, Michael considered stepping into the dark water. The current called to him with terrible softness, promising reunion. But as he leaned forward, he remembered Anna's dream voice. "You can't live in memory alone." The words pulled him back. He dropped to his knees, sobbing into the night, and realized survival was not about forgetting. It was about carrying memory without drowning in it. From that night onward, Michael sought fragile ways to live. He started sketching in Anna's old notebook, his crude drawings nowhere near her delicate artistry. But honest, he walked through new neighborhoods, allowing the unfamiliar to soften the sharpness of memory. He spoke to strangers more not about Anna, but about anything, whether books, politics, small steps, but each one a rebellion against the silence of grief. Still, every moment carried the echo, 1 second later. And his life had turned into memory. Even as he tried to walk forward, Anna's shadow walked beside him, both anchor and companion. He began to realize that grief was not a wound to heal but a country he must learn to live in, where every building, every street, every sound carried her imprint. Memory was both prison and home. On the 2nd anniversary of her passing, Michael lit a candle in their window. The flame danced against the glass, visible to the dark street below. He whispered, "You're still with me." And for the first time in years, he felt a strange warmth not entirely his own. Perhaps memory was not the end of love but its truest form. A fire that endured, even when the body was gone. Michael awoke one morning to the sound of birdsong outside his window. Startled him, not because it was rare, but because he realized he hadn't noticed such things in years. The song was sharp, joyful, insistent, and for a moment he forgot to feel sorrow. He sat up, staring at the window, and felt something he hadn't in a long time, the pulse of the present. It frightened him almost as much as it relieved him. Later that day, while walking through the marketplace, Michael bumped into a young woman carrying a sketchbook. Her papers spilled, drawings fluttering like birds. He bent down to help gather them. And as he handed them back, he saw Anna's favorite subject staring at him. A sketch of a shoreline at dusk, with waves stretching like veins into the sand. The young woman smiled and said, "It's where my mother used to take me. I always draw it to remember her." The words cracked something open in him. For years, Michael believed memory was his private burden. But here was another soul using art to carry the weight of absence. They spoke briefly, sharing small fragments of grief. And though they parted quickly, he felt lighter. And if memory was no longer only his. That night he dreamed of Anna. But for the first time she was silent, simply smiling at him from across a table. But though giving permission, the dream lingered. Michael began to see memory not as a trap but as a bridge, something connecting him to others who carried their own ghosts. At a local library, he attended a grief support group almost by accident. He sat in the corner, listening, until an elderly man spoke of his wife. "Every time I make tea, I still set out 2 cups. Michael's heart jolted. He had done the same countless times. Suddenly, he wasn't alone. Week after week, he returned. At first, he said little. But eventually, words spilled from him. He described Anna's laugh, her art, the scent of her scarves. The group listened without judgment. And in their silence, he found validation. Memory was no longer madness, it was love surviving in fragments. He began to believe that speaking her name aloud kept her alive in ways his journals never could. Still, the paradox remained. Every joy felt tinged with betrayal. One evening, after leaving the group, he wandered into a theater where a small jazz band was playing. The music swelled with improvisation and sorrow, each note like a heartbeat rediscovered. For an hour, Michael closed his eyes and let the rhythm lift him. But afterward, guilt crashed down. Could he truly allow himself to feel alive while Anna remained only a memory? He walked home in the rain, berating himself, until he saw a child dancing in puddles, laughing as water splashed high. The sight made him pause. Anna would have loved it. She would have been the first to jump in alongside the child. Suddenly, he realized joy didn't erase her. It honored her. To feel happiness was not betrayal but continuation. That night, he wrote in his journal, "You are not gone when I smile. You are in the smile itself." Spring arrived. And with it, blossoms painted the streets pink and white. Michael found himself carrying his camera again, photographing details Anna would have adored. Cracks in old walls where flowers dared to bloom, the symmetry of shadows on ancient buildings, the curve of a bridge against the setting sun. Each photo became a conversation. "Do you see this?" And in his heart, he felt her answer, "Yes, always." One afternoon, while photographing a mural, Michael overheard 2 students arguing about art. One insisted that all art was about the future. The other argued it was about the past. Michael smiled to himself, thinking, perhaps it was both. Memory, after all, was art, and his life had become its canvas. He walked away lighter, holding his camera like a compass. Despite these glimmers, darkness still visited him. Nights carried whispers of despair. And some mornings he woke drenched in sweat, certain Anna's absence was unbearable. But now he had tools, the group, his journal, his camera. Each acted as lifeboats against the sea of grief. He realized survival was not one grand decision but many small choices, repeated every day. Then came the turning point. One evening, at a gallery exhibition downtown, Michael found himself staring at a painting of a woman by the sea. The brushstrokes were rough, but the essence was unmistakable. The tilt of her head, the softness of her gaze. It was Anna, not literally, but so close that his breath caught. He stood frozen until the artist approached and said, "She's inspired by my late wife." They talked, 2 widowers bound by brushstrokes and silence. The artist explained, "Grief doesn't end. It just teaches you to paint differently." Michael carried those words home like scripture. That night, he did not write in his journal. Instead, he set up a blank canvas and tried to paint. The strokes were clumsy, but each was a heartbeat. By dawn, his hands were covered in color. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir that wasn't only pain. Michael realized then that memory could transform, not just into sorrow, but into creation, into connection, into life reshaped. 1 second later, Anna's death had turned his life into memory. But now, slowly, 1 second later was turning memory back into life. Michael began to wake each morning not with dread, but with ritual. He still lit the candle by Anna's photo, still whispered her name into the quiet. But now he followed it with action. A walk, a sketch, a visit to the cafe where life continued to hum. Memory was no longer a wall between him and the world, but a window through which he saw it differently. At the cafe, he started sketching people. Couples laughing, a barista's hurried dance, a child pressing her nose against the glass. Each drawing felt like Anna's influence guiding his hand. Sometimes, strangers would glance over and ask, "Who taught you to draw?" Michael would smile and say, "Someone who still teaches me." He didn't need to explain further. When spring became summer, Michael joined the grief group on a retreat by the sea. Standing at the shoreline, waves licking at his shoes, he felt both small and infinite. He closed his eyes, and in the rush of the tide, he heard Anna's laughter, not as a memory, and as part of the living world. Tears ran down his face, but they were softer, gentler, the tears of someone who finally understood. On the retreat's final night, lanterns were released into the sky. Michael watched the lights drift upward, glowing against the dark, and thought of how memory, too, rises, not to erase the dark, and to puncture it with sparks. He whispered into the night, "I carry you, Anna, always." And for the first time, the words were not heavy. They were wings. Back home, Michael filled his apartment with life again. Plants climbed toward the windows, books spilled across the table, unfinished canvases leaned against walls. The shrine of sorrow transformed into a studio of memory. Friends returned, sensing the change, and laughter began to echo in the rooms once more. The space was no less Anna's, but now it was his too. Sometimes he still broke down. Grief is not a river that runs dry, but an ocean that ebbs and flows. Yet when those nights came, Michael no longer feared them. He allowed the tide to wash over him, knowing it would recede, leaving him stronger, steadier. He no longer fought memory. He welcomed it as proof of love that had once lived in flesh and now lived in spirit. One day, while walking through the park, Michael noticed a young couple taking photos by the fountain. Their laughter was so free, their joy so full, that he stopped and smiled. For a fleeting second, he imagined Anna at his side, her hand brushing his, sharing the moment. And instead of sorrow, he felt gratitude. To have known love so deep that its echo lasted beyond time was a gift, not a curse. Seasons turned again, and Michael aged. His hair grayed, his steps slowed, but his eyes carried a light that had once been extinguished. In conversations, he spoke Anna's name without hesitation, weaving her into the fabric of his ongoing life. To those who asked, he said simply, "She is gone, but she is with me. She always will be." At night, he sometimes dreamed of that first moment 1 second later, when life turned into memory. The shock, the agony, the disbelief. But now, in those dreams, the memory didn't end with her absence. Instead, it stretched into years of survival, resilience, and unexpected beauty. He saw himself painting, laughing, carrying lanterns into the sky. Even in sleep, he knew the story had changed. On the anniversary of Anna's passing, Michael visited the riverbank once more. The water glimmered under moonlight, carrying reflections like liquid stars. He set down a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind she used to tuck into vases around their home, and whispered, "We lived. We still live." He closed his eyes, breathed in the night, and felt her presence not behind him, not beside him, and within him. As he walked home, lanterns from a distant festival rose into the air, scattering gold across the dark sky. Michael smiled, knowing Anna was not lost in memory alone. She was part of every sunrise, every laugh, every brushstroke, every breath he took. Life had turned into memory, yes, but memory had turned into life again.